Talk. Gorham Case, Secession of Friends. 1847 to 1851. It is not by the state that man can be regenerated, and the terrible woes of this darkened world effectually dealt with. Gladstone, 1894. The test case of toleration at the moment of the Oxford election of 1847 was the admission of the Jews to sit in Parliament, and in the last month of 1847 Mr. Gladstone astonished his father, as well as a great host of his political supporters, by voting with the government in favor of the removal of Jewish disabilities. No ordinary degree of moral courage was needed for such a step by the member for such a constituency. It is a painful decision to come to, he writes in his diary, December 16, but the only substantive doubt it raises is about remaining in Parliament, and it is truly and only the Church which holds me there, though she may seem to some to draw me from it. Pusey wrote to him in rather violent indignation, for Mr. Gladstone was the only man of that school who learned, or was able to learn, what the modern state is or is going to be. This was the third phase, so Gladstone argued, of an irresistible movement. The Tory party had fought first for an Anglican parliament, second they fought for a Protestant parliament, and now they were fighting for a Christian parliament. Parliament had ceased to be Anglican and it had ceased to be Protestant, and the considerations that supported these two earlier operations thenceforth condemned the exclusion from full civil rights of those who were not Christians. To his father he explained, December 17, 1847, after much consideration, prolonged indeed I may say for the last 2 years and a half, I made up my mind to support Lord John Russell's bill for the admission of the Jews. I spoke to this effect last night. It is with reluctance that I give the vote, but I am convinced that after the civil privileges we have given them already, including the magistracy and the franchise, and after the admission we have already conceded to Unitarians who refuse the whole of the most vital doctrines of the gospel, we cannot compatibly with entire justice and fairness refuse to admit them. His father, who was sometimes exacting, complained of concealment. Mr. Gladstone replied that he regarded the question as one of difficulty, and he therefore took as much time as he possibly could for reflection upon it, though he never intended to run it as close as it actually came. I know, he says, in a notable sentence, it seems strange to you that I should find it necessary to hold my judgment in suspense on a question which seemed to many so plain, but suspense is of constant occurrence in public life upon very many kinds of questions, and without it errors and inconsistencies would be much more frequent than even they are now. This did not satisfy his father. I shall certainly read your speech to find some fair apology for your vote, good and satisfactory reason I do not expect. I cannot doubt you thought you withheld your opinions from me under the undecided state you were in, without any intention whatever to annoy me. There is, however, a natural closeness in your disposition, with a reserve towards those who may think they may have some claim to your confidence, probably increased by official habits, which it may perhaps in some cases be worth your inquiring into. The sentence above about suspense is a key to many misunderstandings of Mr. Gladstone's character. His stout-hearted friend Thomas Ackland had warned him, for the sake of his personal influence, to be sure to deal with the Jew question on broad grounds, without refining, and without dragging out some recondite view not seen by common men, in short, to be as little as possible like Maurice, and more like the Duke of Wellington. My speech, Mr. Gladstone answered, was most unsatisfactory in many ways, but I do not believe that it mystified or puzzled anybody. Jewish disabilities. The following year he received the honor of a DCL degree at Oxford. Mrs. Gladstone was there, he tells his father, and was well satisfied with my reception, though it is not to be denied that my vote upon the Jew bill is upon the whole unpalatable there, and they had been provoked by a paragraph in the Globe newspaper stating that I was to have the degree, and that this made it quite clear that the minority was not unfavorable to the Jew bill. July 5, I went off after breakfast to Oxford. Joined the V.Sc. and doctors in the hall at Wadham, and went in procession to the divinity schools provided with a white neckcloth by Sir R. Inglis, who seized me at the station in horror and alarm when he saw me with a black one. In due time we were summoned to the theatre where my degree had been granted with some non-placets but with no scrutiny. The scene remarkable to the eye and mind, so pictorial and so national. There was great tumult about me, the hisses being obstinate, and the fodors also very generous. Gladstone and the Jew bill came sometimes from the gallery, sometimes more favoring sounds. 2. After the Whig government was formed in 1846, Mr. Gladstone expressed himself as having little fear that they could do much harm, barring church patronage. He was soon justified in his own eyes in this limitation of his confidence, for the next year Dr. Hampden was made a bishop, 232. This was a rude blow both to the university which had 11 years before pronounced him heretical, and to the bishops who now bitterly and fervidly remonstrated. Grave points of law were raised, but Mr. Gladstone, though warmly reprobating the Prime Minister's recommendation of a divine so sure to raise the hurricane, took no leading part in the strife that followed. Never in my opinion, he said to his father, February 2, 1848, was a firebrand more wantonly and gratuitously cast. It was an indication the more of a determination to substitute a sort of general religion for the doctrines of the Church. The next really marking incident after the secession of Newman was a decision of a court of law, known as the Gorham Judgment. This and the preferment of Hampden to his bishopric produced the second great tide of secession. Were we together, Mr. Gladstone writes to Manning at the end of 1849, December 30th, I should wish to converse with you from sunrise to sunset on the Gorham case. It is a stupendous issue. Perhaps they will evade it. On abstract grounds this would be still more distasteful than a decision of the state against a Catholic doctrine. But what I feel is that as a body we are not ready yet for the last alternatives. More years must elapse from the secession of Newman and the group of secessions which, following or preceding, belonged to it. A more composed and settled state of the public mind in regard to our relations with the Church of Rome must supervene. There must be more years of faithful work for the Church to point to an argument, and to grow into her habits. And besides all these very needful conditions of preparation for a crisis, I want to see the question more fully answered. What will the state of its own free and good will do, or allow to be done, for the Church while yet in alliance with it? The Gorham case was this: a bishop refused to institute a clergyman to a vicarage in the west of England, on the ground of unsound doctrine upon regeneration by baptism. The clergyman sought a remedy in the Ecclesiastical Court of Arches. The judge decided against him. The case then came on appeal before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and here a majority with the two archbishops as assessors reversed the decision of the court below. The bishop, one of the most combative of the human race, flew to Westminster Hall, tried move upon move in Queen's Bench, Exchequer, Common Pleas, declared that his archbishop had abused his high commission, and even actually renounced communion with him. But the sons of Zeruiah were too hard. The religious world in both of its two standing camps was convulsed, for if Gorham had lost the day it would or might have meant the expulsion from the establishment of Calvinists and evangelicals bag and baggage. I am old enough, said the provost of Oriel, to remember 3 baptismal controversies, and this is the first in which one party has tried to eject the other from the Church. On the other hand, the sacramental wing found it intolerable that fundamental doctrines of the Church should be settled under the veil of royal supremacy, by a court possessed of no distinctly Church character. The Judgment. The judgment was declared on March 8, 1850, and Manning is made to tell a vivid story about going to Mr. Gladstone's house, finding him ill with influenza, sitting down by his bedside and telling him what the court had done, whereon Mr. Gladstone started up, threw out his arms and exclaimed that the Church of England was gone unless it relieved itself by some authoritative act. A witty judge once observed in regard to the practice of keeping diaries, that it was wise to keep diary enough at any rate to prove an alibi. According to Mr. Gladstone's diary, he was not laid up until several days later, when he did see various people, Manning included, in his bedroom. On the black day of the judgment, having dined at the palace the night before, and having friends to dine with him on this night, he records a busy day, including a morning spent after letter writing, in discussion with Manning, Hope, and others on the Gorham case and its probable consequences. This slip of memory in the Cardinal is trivial and not worth mentioning, but perhaps it tends to impair another vivid scene described on the same authority, how 13 of them met at Mr. Gladstone's house, agreed to a declaration against the judgment, and proceeded to sign, how Mr. Gladstone, standing with his back to the fire, began to demur, and when pressed by Manning to sign, asked him in a low voice whether he thought that as a Privy Councillor he ought to sign such a protest, and finally how Manning, knowing the pertinacity of his character, turned and said, "We will not press him further." 233. This graphic relation looks as if Mr. Gladstone were leaving his friends in the lurch. None of them ever said so, none of them made any signs of thinking so. There is no evidence that Mr. Gladstone ever agreed to the resolution at all, and there is even evidence that points presumptively the other way, that he was taking a line of his own, and arguing tenaciously against all the rest for delay. 234. Mr. Gladstone was often enough in a hurry himself, but there never was a man in this world more resolute against being hurried by other people. 235. Exciting effect of the judgment. We need not, however, argue probabilities. Mr. Gladstone no sooner saw the story than he pronounced it fiction. In a letter to the writer of the book on Cardinal Manning, January 14, 1896, he says, "I read with surprise Manning's statement, made first after 35 years, that I would not sign the Declaration of 1850 because I was a Privy Councillor. I should not have been more surprised had he written that I told him I could not sign because my name began with G. I had done stronger things than that when I was not only Privy Councillor but official servant of the Crown, nay, I believe Cabinet Minister. The Declaration was liable to many interior objections. 7 out of the 13 who signed did so without, I believe, any kind of sequel. I wish you to know that I entirely disavow and disclaim Manning's statement as it stands. And here I have to ask you to insert 2 lines in your second or next edition, with the simple statement that I prepared and published with promptitude and elaborate argument to show that the Judicial Committee was historically unconstitutional, as an organ for the decision of ecclesiastical questions. This declaration was entitled, I think, A Letter to the Bishop of London on the Ecclesiastical Supremacy. If I recollect right, while it dealt little with theology, it was a more pregnant production than the Declaration, and it went much nearer the mark. It has been repeatedly published, and is still on sale at Murray's. I am glad to see that Sidney Herbert, a gentleman if ever there was one, also declined to sign. It seems to me now, that there is something almost ludicrous in the propounding of such a congeries of statements by such persons as we were, not the more, but certainly not the less, because of being Privy Councillors. It was a terrible time, aggravated for me by heavy cares and responsibilities of a nature quite extraneous, and far beyond all others by the illness and death of a much-loved child, with great anxieties about another. My recollections of the conversations before the Declaration are little but a mass of confusion and bewilderment. I stand only upon what I did. No one of us, I think, understood the actual position, not even our lawyers, until Baron Alderson printed an excellent statement on the points raised. 236. 3. For long the new situation filled his mind. The case of the Church of England at this moment, he wrote to Lord Lyttelton, is a very dismal one, and almost leaves men to choose between a broken heart and no heart at all. But at present it is all dark or only twilight which rests upon our future. He busily set down thoughts upon the supremacy. He studied Cawdrey's case, and he mastered Lord Coke's view of the law. He feels better pleased with the Reformation in regard to the supremacy, but also much more sensible of the drifting of the Church since, away from the range of her constitutional securities, and more than ever convinced how thoroughly false is the present position. As to himself and his own work in life, in reply I suppose to something urged by Manning, he says, April 29, 1850, I have 2 characters to fulfill, that of a lay member of the Church, and that of a member of a sort of wreck of a political party. I must not break my understood compact with the last, and forswear my profession, unless and until the necessity has arisen. That necessity will plainly have arisen for me when it shall have become evident that justice cannot, i.e., will not, be done by the state to the Church. With boundless exaltation of spirit he expatiated on the arduous and noble task which it was now laid upon the children of the Church of England amid trouble, suspense, and it might be even agony to perform. Fully believing that the death of the Church of England is among the alternative issues of the Gorham case, he wrote to a clerical friend, April 9, "I yet also believe that all Christendom and all its history have rarely afforded a nobler opportunity of doing battle for the faith and the Church than that now offered to English churchmen. That opportunity is a prize far beyond any with which the days of her prosperity, in any period, can have been adorned." He does not think, June 1, 1850, that a loftier work was ever committed to men. Such vast interests were at stake, such unbounded prospects opened before them. What they wanted was the divine art to draw from present terrible calamities and appalling future prospects the conquering secret to rise through the struggle into something better than historical Anglicanism, which essentially depended on conditions that have passed away. "In my own case," he says to Manning a little later, "there is work ready to my hand and much more than enough for its weakness, a great mercy and comfort. But I think I know what my course would be, were there not. It would be to set to work upon the holy task for clearing, opening, and establishing positive truth in the Church of England, which is an office doubly blessed, inasmuch as it is both the business of truth, and the laying of firm foundations for future union in Christendom." If this vision of a dream had ever come to pass, perhaps Europe might have seen the mightiest Christian doctor since Bossuet, and just as Bossuet's struggle was called the grandest spectacle of the 17th century, so to many eyes this might have appeared the greatest of the 19th. Mr. Gladstone did not see, in truth he never saw, any more than Bossuet saw in his age, that the time spirit was shifting the foundations of the controversy. However that may be, the interesting thing for us in the history of his life is the characteristic blaze of battle that this case now kindled in his breast. View of the crisis in the Church. On the eve of his return from Germany in the autumn of 1845, one of his letters to Mrs. Gladstone reveals the pressing intensity of his conviction, deepened by his intercourse with the grave and pious circles at Munich and at Stuttgart, of the supreme interest of spiritual things. "In my wanderings my thoughts too have had time to travel, and I have had much conversation upon church matters first at Munich and since coming here with Mrs. Craven and some connections of hers staying with her, who are Roman Catholics of a high school. All that I can see and learn induces me more and more to feel what a crisis for religion at large is this period of the world's history, how the power of religion and its permanence are bound up with the Church, how inestimably precious would be the Church's unity, inestimably precious on the one hand, and on the other to human eyes immeasurably remote, lastly how loud, how solemn is the call upon all those who hear and who can obey it, to labor more and more in the spirit of these principles, to give themselves, if it may be, clearly and wholly to that work. It is dangerous to put indefinite thoughts, instincts, longings, into language which is necessarily determinate. I cannot trace the line of my own future life, but I hope and pray it may not always be where it is. Ireland, Ireland. That cloud in the west, that coming storm, the minister of God's retribution upon cruel and inveterate and but half-atoned injustice. Ireland forces upon us those great social and great religious questions. God grant that we may have courage to look them in the face, and to work through them. Were they over, were the path of the Church clear before her, as a body able to take her trial before God and the world upon the performance of her work as His organ for the recovery of our country, how joyfully would I retire from the barren, exhausting strife of merely political contention. I do not think that you would be very sorrowful. As to ambition in its ordinary sense, we are spared the chief part of its temptations. If it has a valuable reward upon earth over and above a good name, it is when a man is enabled to bequeath to his children a high place in the social system of his country. That cannot be our case. The days are gone by when such a thing might have been possible. To leave to Willie a title with its burdens and restraints and disqualifications, but without the material substratum of wealth, and the duties and means of good, as well as the general power attending it, would not I think be acting for him in a wise and loving spirit, assuming, which may be a vain assumption, that the alternative could ever be before us. The fact that in Scotland, a country in which Mr. Gladstone passed so much time and had such lively interests, the members of his own Episcopal Church were dissenters, was well fitted to hasten the progress of his mind in the liberal direction. Certain it is that in a strongly written letter to a Scotch bishop at the end of 1851, Mr. Gladstone boldly enlarged upon the doctrine of religious freedom, with a directness that kindled both alarm and indignation among some of his warmest friends. 237, away, he cried, with the servile doctrine that religion cannot live but by the aid of parliaments. When the state has ceased to bear a definite and full religious character, it is our interest and our duty alike to maintain a full religious freedom. It is this plenary religious freedom that brings out in full vigor the internal energies of each communion. Of all civil calamities the greatest is the mutilation, under the seal of civil authority, of the Christian religion itself. One fine passage in this letter denotes an advance in his political temper, as remarkable as the power of the language in which it finds expression. It is a great and noble secret, that of constitutional freedom, which has given to us the largest liberties, with the steadiest throne and the most vigorous executive in Christendom. I confess to my strong faith in the virtue of this principle. I have lived now for many years in the midst of the hottest and noisiest of its workshops, and have seen that amidst the clatter and the din a ceaseless labor is going on, stubborn matter is reduced to obedience, and the brute powers of society like the fire, air, water, and mineral of nature are, with clamor indeed but also with might, educated and shaped into the most refined and regular forms of usefulness for man. I am deeply convinced that among us all systems, whether religious or political, which rest on a principle of absolutism, must of necessity be, not indeed tyrannical, but feeble and ineffective systems, and that methodically to enlist the members of a community, with due regard to their several capacities, in the performance of its public duties, is the way to make that community powerful and healthful, to give a firm seat to its rulers, and to engender a warm and intelligent devotion in those beneath their sway. 238. Foundations of Liberalism. These were the golden trumpet notes of a new time. When they readied the ears of old Dr. Routh, as he sat in wig and cassock among his books and manuscripts at Magdalen, revolving nearly 100 years of mortal life, he exclaimed that he had heard enough to be quite sure that no man holding such opinions as these could ever be a proper member for the University of Oxford. A few months later, it was seen how the learned man found several hundreds of unlearned to agree with him. 4. This chapter naturally closes with what was to Mr. Gladstone one of the dire catastrophes of his life. With growing dismay he had seen Manning drawing steadily towards the edge of the cataract. When he took the ominous step of quitting his charge at Leamington, Mr. Gladstone wrote to him from Naples, January 26, 1851. Without description from you, I can too well comprehend what you have suffered. Such griefs ought to be sacred to all men, they must be sacred to me, even did they not touch me sharply with a reflected sorrow. You can do nothing that does not reach me, considering how long you have been a large part both of my actual life and of my hopes and reckonings. Should you do the act which I pray God with my whole soul you may not do, it will not break, however it may impair or strain, the bonds between us. If you go over, he says, in another letter of the same month, I should earnestly pray that you might not be as others who have gone before you, but might carry with you a larger heart and mind, able to raise and keep you above that slavery to a system, that exaggeration of its forms, that disposition to rivet every shackle tighter and to stretch every breach wider, which makes me mournfully feel that the men who have gone from the Church of England after being reared in her and by her, are far more keen, and I must add, far more cruel adversaries to her, than were the mass of those whom they joined. In the case of Hope there had been for some considerable time a lingering sense of change. My affection for him, during these later years before his change, was I may almost say intense. There was hardly anything I think which he could have asked me to do, and which I would not have done. But as I saw more and more through the dim light what was to happen, it became more and more like the affection felt for one departed. Hope, he says, was not one of those shallow souls who think that such a relation can continue after its daily bread has been taken away. At the end of March he enters in his diary, wrote a paper on Manning's question and gave it him. He smote me to the ground by announcing with suppressed emotion that he is now upon the brink, and Hope too. Such terrible blows not only overset and oppress but, I fear, demoralize me. On the same day in April 1851, Manning and Hope were received together into the Roman Church. Political separations, though these two have their pangs, must have seemed to Mr. Gladstone trivial indeed, after the tragic severance of such a fellowship as this had been. Manning and Hope go over. They were my two props, he wrote in his diary the next day. Their going may be to me a sign that my work is gone with them. One blessing I have, total freedom from doubts. These dismal events have smitten, but not shaken. The day after that, he made a codicil to his will, striking out Hope as executor, and substituting Northcote. Friendship did not die, but only lived as it lives between those who inhabit separate worlds. Communication was not severed, social intercourse was not avoided, and both on occasions in life, the passing by of which, as Hope Scott said, would be a loss to friendship, and on smaller opportunities, they corresponded in terms of the old affection. Quis desideria was Mr. Gladstone's docket on one of Hope's letters, and in another, 1858, Hope communicates in words of tender feeling the loss of his wife, and the consolatory teachings of the faith that she, like himself, had embraced, and he recalls to Mr. Gladstone that the root of their friendship which struck the deepest was fed by a common interest in religion, 239. In Manning's case the wound cut deeper, and for many years the estrangement was complete, 240, to Wilberforce, the Archdeacon, Mr. Gladstone wrote, April 11, 1851. I do indeed feel the loss of Manning, if and as far as I am capable of feeling anything. It comes to me cumulated, and doubled, with that of James Hope. Nothing like it can ever happen to me again. Arrived now at middle life, I never conform, I suppose, with any other two men the habits of communication, counsel, and dependence, in which I have now for from 15 to 18 years lived with them both. My intellect does deliberately reject the grounds on which Manning has proceeded. Indeed, they are such as go far to destroy my confidence, which was once and far too long at the highest point, in the healthiness and soundness of his. To show that at any rate this is not from the mere change he has made, I may add, that my conversations with Hope have not left any corresponding impression upon my mind with regard to him. A wider breach was this same year made in his inmost circle. In April of the year before, a little daughter, between 4 and 5 years old, had died, and was buried at Foscay. The illness was long and painful, and Mr. Gladstone bore his part in the nursing and watching. He was tenderly fond of his little children, and the sorrow had a peculiar bitterness. It was the first time that death entered his married home. When he returned to Foscay in the autumn, he found that his father had taken a decided step, nay a stride, in old age, not having lost any of his interest in politics, but grown quite mild. The old man was nearing his 87th year. The very wreck of his powerful and simple nature is full of grandeur. Mischief is at work upon his brain, that indefatigable brain which has had to stand all the wear and pressure of his long life. In the spring of 1851 he finds him very like a spent cannonball, with a great and sometimes almost frightful energy remaining in him, though weak in comparison with what he was. He hits a very hard knock to those who come across him. When December came, the veteran was taken seriously ill, and the hope disappeared of seeing him even reach his 87th birthday, December 11th. On the 7th he died. As Mr. Gladstone wrote to Phillimore, though with little left either of sight or hearing, and only able to walk from one room to another or to his brougham for a short drive, though his memory was gone, his hold upon language even for common purposes imperfect, the reasoning power much decayed, and even his perception of personality rather indistinct, yet so much remained about him as one of the most manful, energetic, affectionate, and simple-hearted among human beings, that he still filled a great space to the eye, mind, and heart, and a great space is accordingly left void by his withdrawal. The death of my father, Mr. Gladstone wrote to his brother John, is the loss of a great object of love, and it is the shattering of a great bond of union. Among few families of 5 persons will be found differences of character and opinion to the same aggregate amount as among us. We cannot shut our eyes to this fact, by opening them, I think we may the better strive to prevent such differences from begetting estrangement. Footnotes 232, see above, page 167. 233, Purcell, Manning, IA pages 528 to 33. 234, C.J. Abia Hope's letter, undated, in Purcell, I, page 530. 235, on March 13, Hope writes to Mr. Gladstone from 14, Curzon Street, Keble and Pusey have been with me today, and the latter has suggested some alterations in the resolutions. I have taken upon me to propose a meeting at your house at 10:15 tomorrow morning. If you cannot or do not wish to be present, I do not doubt you will at any rate allow me the use of your rooms. The meeting seems to have taken place, for the entry on March 14 in Mr. Gladstone's diary is this: Hope, Baddeley, Talbot, Cavendish, Denison, Dr. Pusey, Keble, Bennett, here from 9 3/4 to 12 on the draft of the resolutions. Baddeley again in the evening. On the whole, I resolved to try some immediate effort. This would appear to be the last meeting, and Manning is not named as present. On the 18th, Drs. Emil, Pusey, etc., met here in the evening. I was not with them. On the same day Mr. Gladstone had written to the Reverend W. Maskell, as respects myself, I do not intend to pursue the consideration of them with those who meet tonight, first, because the pressure of other business has become very heavy upon me, and secondly and mainly, because I do not consider that the time for any enunciation of a character pointing to ultimate issues will have arrived until the Gorham judgment shall have taken effect. No later meeting is ever mentioned. 236, Purcell professed to rectify the matter in the 4th edition, page 536, but the reader is nowhere told that Mr. Gladstone disavowed the original story. 237, Letter to the Right Reverend William Skinner, Bishop of Aberdeen and Primus, on the functions of laymen in the Church, reprinted in Gleanings, 6. Also letter to Mr. Gladstone on this letter by Charles Wordsworth, the Warden of Glenalmond. Oxford. J. H. Parker, 1852. 238, Gleanings, 6. Page 17. 239, in 1868 Mr. Gladstone urged him to produce an abridged version of Lockhart's Life of Scott. Then Hope found that his father-in-law's own abridgment was unknown, and, 1871, asks Mr. Gladstone's leave to dedicate a reprint of it to him as one among those who think that Scott still deserves to be remembered, not as an author only, but as a noble and vigorous man. 240, from 1853 to 1861 they did not correspond nor did they even meet.